Hello, everyone. Today we are going to start getting into the causes of World War I, which happened from 1914 to 1918, sometimes called the war to end all wars, though, of course, as World War II would later prove, it definitely didn't. So, we're going to first, before we get into that, talk about how we got here. So, World War I was this extreme, earth changing event. It was a new level in warfare. It ended up creating devastation that had not been seen in most of the world in human history. We do know that the richest countries in Europe were competing for colonies in Africa, the Americas, and Asia. But how did this end up in a war where nearly 20 million people died violently? That's not to say anything of the additional tens of millions of people that died from the influenza epidemic of 1918 that was ripping through the world at the time, which we'll look at a bit as well. So let's think about this question. Would they end up in this war? How did the world end up in this war? Which, by the way, the United States also joined near the very end. Let's go back a little bit to answer this question. Let's go back to 1815. So Napoleon, as you remember, was the guy who took over France following the revolution and did a bunch of mucking around Europe and other parts of North Africa and that part of the world, and conquered Europe, then got pushed out, then got exiled, and then he got defeated again when he came back. And that time they exiled him to the island of St. Helena, exiled him for good. That was it for Napoleon. He died on St. Helena, which is in the middle of nowhere in the Atlantic Ocean. So Napoleon's gone. There were no bowling alleys on St. Helena. This is a fiction. So in the Congress of Vienna from 1814 to 1815, European leaders met after his defeat. They were already planning it, and they ended up meeting after his final defeat. France lost all the areas that Napoleon conquered, so that was part of this meeting. The main decisions were made by these four great powers of Europe, quote unquote great powers. So that's Britain, Russia, Prussia, and Austria. Wait, who's Prussia? That's not like some little zone of Russia or something? No. Prussia was the most powerful state in what would soon become Germany, but Germany was not yet a unified state. And we'll talk about that in a moment. So this was a group that was getting together to establish a balance of powers to prevent future control by one nation. It was also very intent on reestablishing some of the monarchies and the royal control of these different countries. And they allowed for parliaments, as was happening in England, but at the same time, they wanted to make sure that the monarchies and the royal class had more power than they had under the years following the French Revolution. So this was actually, interestingly enough, as elitist as it is, all these people got together and expressed desire for quote-unquote enlightened governments, of course, under the royals and the educated class and the upper middle class, the bourgeoisie and the upper classes, but what they would consider to be enlightened governments. And it did lead to what we could say would be largely a century of mostly peace in the region. Mostly peace. There were some wars. So there were spheres of influence in Europe that were expanded and changed around. Remember, we talked about spheres of influence where nations control. They have kind of proxy control over an area where they have overwhelming economic and political influence. So, for instance, Russia, their sphere of influence expanded in Eastern Europe. You can see up here, here's Moscow, by the way, and St. Petersburg. And then all the way over here, they had this big chunk of Poland. Poland was technically its own kingdom, but it was largely under the control of the Russian Empire. There's also the creation of the 38-state German Confederation here. So this is the 38-state German Confederation. This is connected by a common language and culture, and this purple one is the boundary of the German Confederation. The German Confederation members, Prussia, which is up here, also kind of bleeding into Poland, and Austria, which is down here, and also there's the Austrian Empire, which we'll talk about in a minute. They become the largest, most powerful kingdoms in Central Europe. France had just been defeated, remember. So over here it's Netherlands. And then interestingly, this little area here is Belgium, right? Also within this German Confederation. This area is Belgium. It's kind of split up. So interesting kind of zone. By the way, you'll also note, what's this about Italy? Well, Italy was not Italy yet. It had not unified either. These are what are called the papal states, which is to say they are under the control of the Vatican. They were Catholic. They were technically called Catholic states, although they kind of had their own. They had their own governments and fought each other and had all kinds of little things. And they ended up unifying in the mid 1800s as well. And then over here we'll talk about is the Ottoman Empire. So we'll get more into all that. So Prussia, right? Let's get into Otto von Bismarck. He came up with this idea, or at least he put it into words, of realpolitik, which is the politics of reality. Bismarck was the Chancellor of Prussia. He was the head of the government. He was not the king, but he was the head of the government. He was not a liberal, but he did make decisions that were politically smart and practical. So very smart at maintaining and gaining power for himself rather than idealistic. So this is such as adopting some of the most popular socialist ideas. So some of these ideas included public health care. And this is while he outlawed the actual socialist party that existed and jailed its leaders. So he would adopt the most popular ideas of his opposition while outlawing the actual party itself. So adaptive, right? Making power, as he believed that building and maintaining power was the most vital purpose of government. So his general idea is that countries are out for themselves. They're out to win against other countries. This idea of nationalism that we talked about before, right? That not just your country is great, but your country is better than all the other countries. That it's competing and it is better than the others. So, realpolitik, I want you to think about as you do prompt number 1 on your worksheet. Name an example of realpolitik in the modern world and describe how it fits the description that you just read about. Okay? So pause. I'm sure you came up with some kind of good thing. You've unpaused by now. Um, there are many things in the real world that could describe realpolitik and many different characters. And hopefully we'll talk about some of those perhaps in some of the journals. So the Austro-Prussian War in 1866. As we said, even though there were not many wars between European powers in the 1800s, there were a few. So in 1866, there was the 7 Weeks' War, which is not very long considering the most recent wars the United States has been in have lasted for around 20 years. Bismarck wanted Prussia to have more power than Austria, which was part of the German Confederation as well, right? But again, competition. So in 1866, Austria and Prussia fought, and Prussia quickly won in this. This is the Prussian crest, by the way, over here. This ended up unifying northern Germany. So the northern part of Germany became unified, and Prussia became the most powerful state in Germany, in the German-speaking world. And Austria was excluded from this new German empire that was forming in this region. So 1867, that doesn't mean that Austria is gone. What it means is that Austria lost some of its territory. And so they ended up forming a new empire in 1867 to regain some of the power and prestige they lost by fusing with their former rival, sometimes friend, neighbor to the east, Hungary, which was a major power in its own right, especially in Eastern Europe. And they formed a new empire called the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This empire was very complex. You can see its entire sphere of influence here, an area of control. There were 11 ethnic groups within this region. You can see all these different ethnic groups and regions that are here. Very, very complicated. And they also quickly reestablished close ties with powerful Prussia because, hey, as we'll learn about with another definition of nationalism, about how it ties into identity, this German thing wasn't necessarily going to get lost so easily. So by the way, down here is the Austro-Hungarian Empire's fusion crowns, is the 2 different crowns. It's pretty big, right? I mean, this is a big chunk of Europe. You can see it right here. It's a big chunk, and it's through a lot of Eastern and Southern Europe. So here for prompt number 2, what are 2 potential issues with having 11 ethnic groups with many languages and many customs? within one empire? What are two potential issues of that? Especially when they're nearby with you, right? Pause and write. Okay, lots of potential answers for that too, right? Obviously, one of the things that they would potentially have is some conflict between different groups who do not speak the same language as the main empire does. Also, let's bear in mind, actually, Austria and Hungary did not even speak the same language. Austrians spoke German. Hungary, they spoke Hungarian. So major difference in the languages there. And what ended up happening is there's all these different groups, different languages, different traditions, lots of potential conflict, lots of different national identities, some of which didn't have quote unquote borders yet, right? And that's a hint of how things are going to be going. So here's another war that came up pretty fast, pretty quick order, the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. This is the kind of region that it was being fought in. All these different states, lots of these former little kingdoms. There's castles all over the place in this region. Lots of small kingdoms that were slowly getting unified into this German empire. Bismarck wanted an even stronger Prussia. So German nationalism began to build throughout all the different regions in the German Confederation, this idea of building a new and powerful country around this unified German identity. The conflict brewed over between France and Prussia, in fact. So France and Prussia had, obviously been in conflict since prior to, for a very long time. There had been conflict between France and Austria, obviously, because Queen Marie Antoinette was Austrian, and there was a war between them that lasted for a long time. Prussia, even though they had fought a war with Austria, were mostly allied with them most of the time, and they had the German thing, so, lots of conflict. So there's conflict brewing over between France and Russia over this disputed border territory here. In this area, there's Alsace-Lorraine and these other areas that they were fighting over. And boy, oh boy, did they fight over these areas a lot. By the way, here's Belgium. This little country controlled all of that Central African region in the Congo. Wow, what a mess. Meanwhile, Russia over here, Russian Empire, and Austria stayed neutral. So Austria stayed neutral in this conflict, because it didn't seem like necessarily Bismarck needed that much help. And in fact, he did not. So Germany had been industrializing very, very fast, and part of its industrialization involved the creation of new and utterly terrifying weaponry. As Friedrich Freyer von Schrott, the Prussian minister, said, Prussia was not a country with an army, but an army with a country. So what you have here going on is a superior German military that had been putting its major industrialization to use to create new and improved weapons. And this was going to create some problems for the French, who had still been kind of recovering from the Napoleonic defeats and had not fully modernized their armies, and their industrialization was going slow. So the France, we're looking at echoes here of what happened in Japan and Russia, right? The country that industrialized quicker also modernized their military quicker. So France was crushed at the Battle of Sedan. This breech-loading Krupp gun down here on the bottom, this only lasted a few weeks. This breech-loading Krupp gun could fire giant shells the size of a human being. They could fire them like they're giant shells. They could fire them 30 miles. So, whole new level of what could potentially happen to people that you're fighting. There were German territorial gains, so there's Alsace-Lorraine on the French border. Germany began to unify. This cartoon shows how all these different countries, these different regions of Germany are getting pulled together. Some of them are like depicted as spoiled children being pulled together here by von Bismarck. They unified in a nationalist fervor. And France was then put on the hook to owe Germany 5 billion francs in damages. And this kind of back and forth with owing damages between Germany and France, we will see how that soon ended up becoming a game that ended up creating a lot of problems for the world. So in 1871, they made it official. Germany was unified in 1871. They established two legislative houses. They established these kinds of machines of democracy. There's the Reichstag and the Bundesrat. It's basically like a legislature, like their parliament, It's like a legislature, two legislative branches, like a Senate and a House of Representatives. It's a Congress. However, the real power remained in the hands of the emperor. That was Kaiser Wilhelm I or William I, and Chancellor Bismarck, who kind of took care of the day-to-day politics, with William I being the official head of state and figurehead for national pride. So that's where the real power stayed. So I want you to think about this question. Why do you think Chancellor Bismarck wanted to have democratic institutions, that's to say the Reichstag and Bundesrat, in Germany, even though in reality he and the Kaiser, the king, were fully in charge? A hint, think about what realpolitik would mean in this. How does realpolitik play into this? So I want you to take a pause and write. Okay, again, lots of potential answers for this, right? But one way or another, you might be leaning toward the direction that perhaps democratic institutions were created because it gave an image of Germany as a modern developed nation with these enlightened ideas, so the rest of Europe accepted them as an important part of Europe, even though there was still a fairly authoritarian control system set up within the country. And this was a tradition that would continue within Germany and help to shape part of what would be to come, which, of course, as we know, was going to be a bit of a mess for a few decades for the rest of the world, although quite successful for Germany. In fact, let's take a look at Germany's economic growth tied to their quick industrialization. Wow, okay, 1890, 2,353 thousands of tons of steel. And this is even after they had industrialized enough to make all these new weapons. But by 1913, after they unified, boom, 19,410 tons of steel per thousands of tons per steel per year. Wow, lots and lots and lots and lots of steel. Same with coal production from 98 to 305, more than tripled. Incredible change in how much the country was putting out. Lots of population growth, lots of industrial growth, growth of cities, major growth in this country. So 1871, here's Germany now unified, economically and militarily stacked, very nationalistic populace. So which neighboring states lost the most territory to the German Empire? Who do you think would be most likely to seek revenge? If you guessed France, you're right. So here we go. Germany, here's a cartoon, au revoir, which means see you later. Germany, farewell, madame, and France says, ha, we will meet again. Those 5 million francs were not to be easily forgotten. Let's take a detour here and go into Southern Europe in the background for what's going on to World War I, right? So let's take a look at the Ottoman Empire. Here's this map of Europe. We were right up here before, right? This is Germany and Austria and Hungary and all this stuff. But let's shoot our way down here to Southern Europe. Wow, Germany sure did get big, didn't it? Boom. Wow, that's a big new country. And oh, look, it looks like Italy unified somewhere in there too. We'll talk a bit about that. But down here in Southern Europe, the Ottoman Empire. What does that look like? What's the country today? It's Turkey. This is Turkish. This is the country that was formed it was the empire that was formed around 1299 CE. It was a Muslim empire centered in Istanbul here on the Straits of the Bosporus. Very important city, had been the center of the Holy Roman Empire prior to this, or not the Holy Roman Empire, I'm sorry, of the Roman Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire. Holy Roman Empire actually was up here in Germany, but the Eastern Roman Empire. So very important time period, very important place historically, been for a long time. And the Ottoman Empire was very large, in fact, began around 1300, and it was Muslim. You can see the Ottoman Empire here. The light pink is the Ottoman Empire, its greatest extent in 1699, going through all these regions, bordering up on Austria, parts of Austria, in fact, before Austria became its own power, including a large chunk of Hungary. All these areas, which we often call the Balkans, which are, whoa boy, they're going to have a lot to go on, right? North Africa, Algeria, Tunisia, Tripoli, Egypt have been part of the Ottoman Empire. Azerbaijan over here, all these areas had been part of the Ottoman Empire, and also Armenia, where in fact we will talk about how, at least a little bit, I hope that to get to the fact that we talk about how the later Turkish Empire, in fact, committed a massive genocide in Armenia, and it was a really awful event. They still not owned up to it. Anatolia here, that's that they call it Anatolia, but this is the Turkish Empire. This is the Ottoman Empire. So now in 1914, however, that's this darker color, right? So part of Syria going through like Iraq here, what is today Iraq, Mesopotamia, what was formerly Mesopotamia, a little bit down into Saudi Arabia here. Wow, not quite what it was by 1914. What's going on there? Lots lost. So how did it get so big? First off, there was a strong military, uh, very indirect rule. So remember, we talked about direct versus indirect. Direct being when the country is ruled from afar, from abroad, by a government that is set up and considering it to be basically part of that overall empire. Like the French territories down here, France took over a lot of these areas, and those areas were just part of France, even though they did not have the same rights or political rights as France. It's the same today. You'll see in the United States, in Puerto Rico, that is direct rule. The United States has direct colonial rule over Puerto Rico. It's territory of the United States. Even though they have some local government, but it's still a territory of the United States. The Ottomans, in turn, however, had very indirect rule, which is where they installed local proxies, local governments. They were technically part of the Ottoman Empire, but they had local rulers who made the main decisions, although they had to make sure they paid taxes to the Ottoman Empire. Um, Also, Europe was usually at war with itself. So Europe was fighting for a long time from these 1600s until the early 1800s with all the revolutions and Napoleon and everything else. Lots of messes, right? And also, the Ottoman Empire was actually tolerant of Judaism, of Jewish people, particularly here in what is today Israel, and was Palestine, and Christianity at a time when there was not a lot of tolerance for those, not a lot of tolerance in general for different religions in these different countries. So usually it would be one country, one primary religion, not a lot of tolerance for others. But the Ottoman Empire was more concerned with collecting its taxes and keeping and having bases and keeping a not super rigid control over a region. They weren't as ideological about it. They were it was as much an economic and trade thing as anything else. Not to say they wouldn't create a lot of problems if a country would push back or a region would push back. So the Ottoman Empire started to go into decline, in fact. It fell behind in industrialization, fell behind in naval power. It was falling behind in resource extraction. So they really weren't taking advantage of their resources. They didn't develop the oil that actually was a huge resource in the regions that they controlled. They didn't control enough ships. They had some problems with conflicts with Russia. There were a bunch of messes going on. And you can see here the Sultan of which is basically the king of the Ottoman Empire. It says, Bismillah, make me into a limited company. I suppose they'll allow me to join the board after allotment. So what they're basically saying is, whoa, wait, you're splitting up the Ottoman Empire? Well, maybe they'll let me at least join the board. What does this look like? Does it seem familiar to you? Or territories starting to fall apart and get reorganized, also losing territory to independence movements. Sometimes this is called the sick man of Europe, which is kind of a racist trope, actually. And like Russia, Europe tended to hold Turkey at arm's length. So, big question here. So here's the Ottoman Empire in 1914 again, right? 1914, it's the dark areas. These lighter areas are all areas that had lots of control. Mid-1800s here for the Balkans, Bulgaria in 1908, Greece in 1829, all these areas, 1882 for Egypt, which got taken over by England, by the way, colonized by England. All these areas were France. Different areas got colonized by the different European powers. So here's the question. What do you think the big European powers will do in response to the Ottoman Empire falling apart? What are they going to do? Pause and write. If you guessed what we were already kind of starting to talk about, well, you're right. Yes, they started to carve it right up. These areas came under various colonial controls. England and France, in particular, split up the Middle East. And again, like before, divided into these arbitrary countries that didn't necessarily have anything in common with each other culturally. So a country like Iraq, which is here, should have really probably been three countries. But by keeping all these different groups that were constantly conflicting with each other together in the same area, well, it tended to allow the British to take and keep control. Serbia, here we go. So we talked about Turkey, right? But up here, this is the Balkans. Serbia is the center of the Balkans, what we call the Balkans. So Serbia has a history of being invaded. Austria and the Ottomans historically fought over Serbia, maintained a sense of Serbian identity despite 400 years of Turkish rule. Remember that the Ottomans did not make that too hard, but still, they really maintained a strong sense of Serbian identity. The Serbian Orthodox Church is a big part of that. Ottoman policies favored local village leadership, and they had a Slavic culture. Slavic is a very important term we'll be talking about more because the Slavs are a really big group. So local village leadership, local leaders, local proxies who would do, ultimately do what the Ottomans asked. They didn't ask for much. So there's a lot of kind of pseudo-independence. And they had their own Orthodox Church, which was a branch of Christianity. It was Eastern Orthodox Christianity, basically a different type of Catholicism from Roman Catholic. In 1804, these differences boiled over into a nationalist revolution by the Serbs. And this is kind of a brutal revolution, but they did succeed. This here is the Skull Tower at Nis, which is a city in Serbia. It is made up of martyrs of the 1804 Serbian nationalist revolution. It was the first time a Christian population had risen up against the Ottomans, and it was successful. They saw a role model in Russia, to the north, which was also a Slavic state. They had similar language, some culture similarities. Writing in particular was very similar. You wouldn't necessarily be able to understand each other talking, but they were from the same basic language group. So Slavic modernizing and a source of competition for the Ottomans. Little wars being fought back and forth. Russia always looking for that warm water port, especially Crimea, which was in this region near Turkey. And the Serbians were angry about Austria, which was, as the Ottoman Empire was going back, Austria was expanding in the Slavic areas to take over areas that the Serbs were leaving. So in terms of that earlier question, what are the European powers are going to do in response to the Ottomans retreating? Well, in the Slavic and Balkan areas, Austria did a lot of expansion. So let's take a look here at Serbia after the Congress of Vienna, in which case there was some stuff being divided up. So Austrian Empire going down here. You can see all this pink. Bosnia and Serbia here. You can see them. They're still part of the Ottoman Empire. They're still part of the Ottoman Empire. They are their own little regions. Montenegro, which was another Slavic region of the Balkans, that had been taken by the Austrians. So you can probably guess where this is going to go, because here's Croatia too, and this is not all of Serbia. So as time went by, Serbia before World War I became a fully independent kingdom in 1882. And neighboring Bosnia, as again the Ottoman Empire began to retreat, neighboring Bosnia was annexed by Austria-Hungary. So it was taken over from the Ottomans and annexed by Austria-Hungary. So this whole region was being kind of ruled by Hungary. And then Serbia was standing as this lone, independent Slavic state, which, as you would imagine, might create some strong feelings and also might create a very strong national identity that's centered in Serbia. Why was Serbia such a target for invasion and conflict? So for prompt number 5, just go back, think about what we just talked about, and think about why Serbia was such a target for invasion and conflict. Pause. Okay, obviously you can see where it is, right? You've talked about all the different things that were going on. There was at the crossroads of various empires and connected to a lot of very important areas that connected to big trade routes as well. As Serbia grew in its identity and this independent state, and as Russia also had its own identity as a big Slavic state, there's this idea of pan-Slavism, and certain Slavs within Serbia and within Russia and these other areas of Eastern Europe that were Slavic, including Ukraine, they developed a Slavic language family. This is Ukraine, by the way. a Slavic language family, and a sense of shared identity. Based on this common written language, you could generally read the language back and forth, even though it's a little hard. Speaking it, you might not be able to make each other out. But some senses of shared identity, this national idea. And this is a late 19th century movement that was forming, focused on the Balkans. You could probably see what the general goal might be here, right? General goal might be to move in and make some changes, connect some areas. Into this comes a group that will be playing a very big role in history coming up called the Black Hand. It was a secret society in Serbia created in 1911. It wanted to unite the Southern Slavs and spread anti-Austrian propaganda. It used assassination as a means of coercion. Over here, you can see a picture of the stamp that they had on one of their communications. It's got a skull and crossbones, obviously looking pretty intimidating. In Serbian, this says join or die. So if you did not join the Black Hand as a Serbian, they're saying, well, you're going to join up with us or you're going to be, yep. So secret society created in 1911 to unite, in particular, the Southern Slavs down here. They really saw this as being something they could unite together. One would imagine that perhaps they would think that maybe this would be united with Serbia as its center, which of course this conflict actually led into stuff leading all through the 20th century, all the way to the civil wars in the 1990s. But again, they used assassination as a means of coercion. Tying into this anti-Austrian propaganda, we will soon learn about how the impact of this went down. So all these things are stacking up. The Industrial Revolution is intensifying. Imperialism and colonialism in Asia and Africa is making enormous amounts of money for the European powers, especially France, England, and Belgium, and this annoyed Germany, who got in the game a little late, and that's going to be playing into things soon too. Meanwhile, Austria-Hungary is facing issues from their shaky empire, especially these Slavic regions to the south that are agitating for independence or maybe becoming part of some new Slavic empire. And tensions across Europe are beginning to increase. So here's the players that we have as we go into World War I. There's, just to review, the Austria-Hungarian Empire, the Balkans around Serbia, Britain to the north, there's the UK, that island, and then also, of course, this chunk of Northern Ireland here they've got. And this time they're actually fully imperializing Ireland as an island. And France, there's France, and Germany. Oh, and Italy, which had also recently formed a new country under Prime Minister Giuseppe Garibaldi. It had unified and became a unified country of its own. Oh, don't forget Russia. Here's Russia. Wow, it's big. It's really big. Russia is really, really big. Oh, and Slavic. Did I mention Slavic? We are going to get so deep into these, and we will get into it next class. But the 5 causes of World War I are militarism, alliances, nationalism, imperialism, and assassination. Mania. Starting next class. So be sure to check on the final prompt on your worksheet, and see you next class. Make sure you do that final prompt.